Aloha. I hope you all enjoyed lunch. We're going to get started right now. Our next speaker, Richie. Gonna bring him up front. Richie is a senior threat hunter at Spectre Ops, and before that, he worked at Apple, so he actually really knows what he's talking about. So we're super stoked to have him talking, so let's give a round of applause for Richie.
All right, thanks for everyone for coming out. Welcome to my talk, When Macs Come Under Attack. Mahalo to Patrick and Andy for throwing this event. This is awesome. I'm happy to be a part of it. Like Patrick said, my name is Richie Cyrus. I work for Spectre Ops on the adversary detection team. And so I'm a fan of most things, network security monitoring, also incident response, and anything related to Apple, besides doing Apple incident response and forensics. Like I'm a big Apple fanboy, so anytime the products come out, Go iPad Pro and new MacBook Air, I'm all in on those. Also, I blog at securityneversleeps.net. And so I cut a lot of my teeth doing the Apple incident response and detection while I was at Apple. And so while I was at Apple, I got introduced to a lot of problem sets around incident response and detection as far as Macs go, especially at scale. And so a lot of this talk will be about how to do those things at scale, and then also from a threat hunting perspective. And so this is a little bit about the outline of the talk. So I'll go into the need for macOS threat hunting, also what the macOS threat landscape, attack landscape looks like today, also the hunt methodology about how to go about hunting for malicious things on macOS systems, and then some of the adversary techniques and detections that you could build around those techniques and tactics, and then also a threat hunting demo. So there'll be an attack going on, and then as threat hunters, we'll see how to go about and collect some of the data, and then also analyze that data to proactively find some threats that occurred. All right, so back in 2007, Apple ran a series of commercials, the PC versus the Mac. And so the PC guy is the guy in the suit, the Mac guy with the cool hoodie on, and right now he's taking care of the PC guys because, well, PCs have over 100,000 viruses and Macs don't get viruses. And we all know today that this is not the case, but although the Mac viruses back then weren't as prevalent, back in 2006, you had things such as the leap worm, where there was evidence that, hey, Macs weren't, fully immune to malicious software or malware, as we call it today. And so this takes us to modern day, where the amount of Macs that we see in the enterprise space at home with a lot of users are continuing to grow. So as the market share for Macs continue to increase, then attackers become more interested in the macOS platform, right? And so by virtue of that, you'll start to see more attacks. So now malware authors are more interested in targeting the user base, people who are using macOS systems. And so you have folks like nation states, APT groups that are now interested. So you have malware X-Agent that was used by APT 28. And then also Ocean Lotus that was used by APT 32. And so that's the sign of the times to come, where you used to just have a lot of crimeware and adware stuff going on Macs, but now you start to see nation states actually be interested and create some malware, custom malware to attack some of the groups that they're interested in. All right, so what's the landscape for today as far as macOS attacks? So before we go into threat hunting and how to do that, we have to understand the attack landscape of today. So how are Macs getting compromised? Well, there's a few ways, and this is kind of unique to macOS. It doesn't really happen too much in the Windows world, but supply chain compromises, which has been pretty prevalent over the last couple years. In this instance here, I show Handbrake. So the Handbrake tool, the download mirror for that tool was actually compromised. And so when folks would go to download what they thought was the original Handbrake, the safe Handbrake, they would install a malicious version that contained a variant of the Proton malware for OS X. And so I also have here listed macOS macros for Word. So there's PDFs, there's Word documents, Excel spreadsheets with macros enables, PDF with like JavaScript, which is allowed to execute to run. So a lot of attackers are still using documents to transport their malicious code onto systems. And then, of course, I mean, all of us in the room at least has one family member who has surfed the net using a Mac, and they come across Adobe Flash and an installer for Adobe Flash. It's 100% most of the time never Adobe Flash, so that's still one of the ways that attackers are able to get onto systems, and that's more of the adware, kind of crimeware side of the house. And so now we'll get into defining threat hunting. And so just to level set about what we mean when we say threat hunting, because depending on what vertical you're in, some of the folks who do incident response consulting compared to some folks who are in an enterprise environment, threat hunting might mean two different things. So in the concept that I'm talking about, threat hunting in this fashion for this presentation, it's actively searching for malicious activity that has evaded defenses in place. And so you have your IDS sitting on your network, you have the firewall in place, you have AV. In today's day and world and time and age, those things, you need those things, especially in a corporate environment, but you have to now know that attackers are aware that those things exist, and then also ways to bypass those things to carry out the rest of their operations. And so attackers know what's there, especially on your network, and they will actively attempt to evade those controls. So this is more a security guard actually walking around the building and monitoring for certain things, as opposed to like sitting back at the desk and watching like CCTV and trying to find out what things are going on around premises. And so we'll go into why do we hunt. And so we hunt because with enough time, enough resources and effort, attackers will get in. Their time is unlimited, right? And sometimes their resources are unlimited as well. So you have to assume breach, right? And so the assume breach mentality is something that has been used for quite some time now, especially in the last 4 to 5 years, where you can no longer rely on just the defenses you have in place to hold you up and keep you away from all attacks, right? And so the mindset used to be, once attackers get in once, it's game over for the defender. And so my colleague Matt Graber at Spectre Ops introduced a mindset where if you start to embrace assume breach, then you introduce the attacker's dilemma into the equation, right? And so the attacker's dilemma being, just switching that around, an attacker has to just trip one of the detections that you built as an analyst in order to kick off the IR process, and then now you're well in the fight to actually get them off the network. And so also Michael Hayden from the NSA and CIA, former, he said fundamentally if someone wants to get in, they're getting in. You have to accept that. You're in the fight whether you thought you weren't or not, and then you're most certainly penetrated, right? And so this is a good premise of like why we actually have to do threat hunting. And so with that, it was like, okay, well, threat hunting primarily focuses on detecting activity after an attack happened because you're assuming that a breach has already occurred, right? And so how can we go about detecting attackers' activities and behaviors post-compromise, right? So it'd be great if we had a repository of all tactics and techniques that attackers could use post-compromise and start to build some of our detections around that. Well, lucky for us, that's where MITRE ATT&CK comes into play. So MITRE ATT&CK is a framework for describing the behavior of cyber adversaries across the intrusion lifecycle. The majority of the framework is based around post-compromise tactics and techniques. And so it's pretty convenient to answer some of the questions and build out detections for your IR team. And so documented in the framework are tactics used by attackers to carry out operations. So that's some of the things like exfiltration, that's some of the things like persistence, privilege escalation, and we'll get into some of those. And then it also includes not only for Mac OS, but also Windows and for Linux. So you could use this across all of your OS platforms. And so how can we utilize this framework to start to do threat hunting? Well, the methodology that we subscribe to at Spectre Ops is to first identify the tactic and technique that you want to use. So going back to MITRE ATT&CK, actually pulling something out, maybe using persistence, and then going in and maybe looking at bash profile and bash RC and understanding that technique. So going in and saying, okay, we want persistence as a tactic and technique. We want bash RC or bash for persistence, and then actually identifying the procedures that were used. So these are the steps that we're taking to actually produce that output. So that could be done a number of different ways. On the Windows side, you could do it through, maybe like command line from cmd.exe, or you could do it through PowerShell, right? For Mac OS, you could do something custom built in a Mac O binary, or you could do it via terminal and the terminal prompt, right? And so the next thing after we identify the tactic and technique and then the procedures, we would go into identifying the collection requirements around that tactic and technique. And then next, identifying the scope. So the scope being how long we want to actually look for this activity on the network. And then also, like, what groups of computers do we want to start to hunt against, right? So is this all of your enterprise? Is this only your executives? Is this only your security team that has Macs? These are some of the things that you lay out in the scope. And then from there, you document your excluded factors. And so Palantir has an awesome framework, is the alerting and detection strategy framework. And so with that, you can also document some of those excluded factors, some of the blind spots from the detections that you have based on either a lack of analyst like skill set, whether it be a lack of like some gaps in your data, maybe you're not able to collect certain data needed to actually build out a detection. And so those sort of things will go into the excluded factors, and some of those gaps will lead into the next hunt that you perform. And so when you start to do this hunt methodology over time, you start to create a minefield for attackers. And so now an attacker has to be careful not to trip one of these techniques, and if they do, then the IR process kicks off, right? And so this is different than if you were to just build a wall for just one tactic. So if you just did execution and you built that whole wall out, well, then you're operating under assumption that an attacker can't come up with a new execution technique, and so you would be completely blind to whatever they do after that, right? And so it was good to build out your detections across numerous tactics. And so in order to start to create this minefield, you have to look into the data, right? What data gives you the best opportunity to create this minefield? And so with that, MITRE ATT&CK has a section which a lot of people don't really focus on, but it is the data sources section. And so with bash profile and bash RC to maintain persistence on a system, you can see here that there's a data sources section. And within that data sources section, you see file monitoring, process command line parameters, and process use of network. So these are some of the data sources you would need in order to build that detection to detect bash RC or bash being used to maintain persistence, right? And so one of the things that I did using the MITRE ATT&CK framework was actually to collect some of the top Mac OS data sources that will give you the best chance to cover as many techniques as far as that matrix goes that we saw earlier, right? So put in as many bombs as possible so the attackers will trip over at least one of those, right? And so the top four were process monitoring, file monitoring, process command line, and process use of network. And so I'll go into some of the tools now, open source tools that can be used to actually collect some of this data that you could use for detection. And so one tool is Google Santa. And so Google Santa was developed by the operations team on the Google side. And so it's for the purpose of binary whitelisting or blacklisting, but on top of that, it also has binary whitelist. On top of that, it also has like process execution, process monitoring. It does application whitelisting, blacklisting, and you can install it as a kernel extension. So that covers the data set of process monitoring. Also, there's XNewmon that was created by Daniel Roethlisberger, and it's supposed to mimic Sysmon for Windows, but only for the Mac OS side. So that provides us with process monitoring. What's cool about this is that it gives you child and parent relationships as far as that goes. And then also, it takes it a step further where you can actually trace the child, the parent from a child, all the way back down to launch D, which is the initial binary that executes, the initial process that executes on the system in user land, right? And so that's pretty cool to see. And then also command line parameters. And so this also tracks the use of processes accessing other processes using syscalls like task or PID, which is important, and then also tracks when a process actually adds or modifies a launch daemon or launch agent. So that's beneficial to us too. So in the future, that tool will have full support for network connections as well. And then also, many of the folks in the room are probably familiar with OS Query, especially on the Mac side, and that's been created by the team at Facebook. And so it could be used for file integrity monitoring, scheduled queries, especially enterprise sweeps. So it's good for point in time. So you want to build a query based on the tables that it provides in kind of like a SQL format. And so you would create your query, and then you would run that query at a set interval over, maybe like every 8 hours, every day, every week, right? And so built in within that too, you can also do some Yara scanning, and then it also has the ability to do process monitoring. It's not the best way to do process monitoring, especially because it piggybacks off of Audit D for Mac, and that's a little clunky to work with. But an honorable mention here is actually SU PR Audit that is created by Jonathan Levin, which is far superior than the PR audit that you have on Mac OS systems, and it piggybacks off of Audit D, because we all know that using PR audit in an enterprise environment, you just can't work with those logs. They're a pain to deal with. So using his tool, you could at least start to make some better use out of the data that gives you. So now we'll get into some of the techniques and tactics that are used by adversaries today. So the first being persistence, right? And so once an attacker gets onto a system, they don't want to lose that access. They have to find a way to survive no matter what the user might do. They want, whether the user reboots or does something crazy to their system, they want to be able to live on that system for an extended period of time to carry out their operations. And so believe me, like working with a lot of red teamers at Spectre Ops, they absolutely hate phishing. So persistence is key, especially on Mac OS. And so one way attackers commonly persist on Mac OS is launch agents and launch daemons. And so this is kind of a diagram flow of like how launch agents and launch daemons work. And so you have launch D that kicks off, and that loads the launch daemons from the system library, then launch daemons from the library, user library, and then also the launch agents are loaded from system library, and then the user's individual library and launch agents. So that's a quick synopsis on launch agents and launch daemons. And so this is what a launch agent looks like. So if you use the PLU tool, -P to print, this is actually the output from the little snitch plist that exists on my system right now. And so the important thing to note is run at load, right? Because if that's set to 0, then the binary associated with that launch agent won't run at load, right? It won't start up. So once that is set to 1, then for certain that's going to exist, and the binary associated with that plist is going to kick off. And so some of the some of the actually launch agents and launch daemons that are used by attackers in the wild. The first image we have here is the co-root rat, and that's persistent via launch daemon. And then we also have another another launch agent that was used in the Mac update website. And so they piggybacked off of Firefox and created like malicious Firefox download, right? And so you were able to download Firefox with some malicious stuff entered into it, and it would actually persist as a launch agent. So down here you see that macOS update plist was actually loaded using launch control, and it installed that plist to the system and the launch agents directory. So that binary associated with that plist is now going to kick off at runtime. And so one of the weird things that you can do using Patrick's tool is actually take a deeper dive into the launch agents and launch daemons on your system. So once one tries to install using this tool, maybe you can take a look and see that the launch agent or launch daemon is actually unsigned, right? And then on top of that, another thing that might stick out is that the startup binary exists in temp, right? And so the fact that it exists in temp and the fact that it's unsigned and it starts with com.apple is probably an indicator, as Jaren mentioned earlier, that, hey, like things are awry. Like that's usually associated with launch agents or launch daemons or things that are signed by Apple. And so with that, we could create our hypothesis that says an attacker has compromised at least one system in our environment and is persisting via a launch agent or a launch daemon. And so with that, I mentioned before that OS query is one of the best tools for using at point in time. So at this point in time, you collect all the launch agents, or you run a specific query that is designated to launch agents and launch daemons, and then at another interval, you would run that scan again, right? Just to make sure that everything is in line. So this is one query that you can actually run for OS query that will get you pretty close to where you want to be. So this is actually doing a join on the signature table and also the launch D table, right? And then is actually selecting all of those that the name is like com.apple, and that it's not signed, so sign equals 0, right? And then also run at load is equal to 1. This will be basically every launch agent on your system that is unsigned, starts with com.apple, and is designed to run at load, right? And so that's pretty good, but it's not good enough. We have to go deeper. And so another hypothesis that we could come up with is that an attacker has compromised at least one system and is persisting via a signed launch agent or a launch daemon in which the associated binary is not signed by Apple. And so in a lot of malware today, we're actually seeing that the malware that is being used by attackers is actually signed in some sort of way using a valid Apple developer certificate, right? And so one way that we can actually build on our existing detection is say that we have a name like com.apple and it is signed, right? But the authority, the signing authority, is not software signing. So software signing in my testing is associated with Apple signed binaries. And so this is saying that if it's not an Apple signed binary, but it's signed and it starts with com.apple and it's designed to run at load, well, then that's something that we might be interested in, right? Well, I mean, that's good, but it's not quite good enough. So let's go a little bit deeper. And so Josh Pitts actually introduced a blog post back in June or July where he stated that he could be Apple and so can anybody else, right? It was he created a way to actually trick the tools that existed out there on the internet, open source and also enterprise level tools, that unsigned code was actually signed by Apple. So it appeared to be signed by Apple when it wasn't, because it was through a misinterpretation of some specific code signing APIs, right? And so one of the requirements for this type of attack is that the unsigned code had to be an architecture of i386. And so we could use that to build on top of our initial detection that says it's com.apple, it's signed, the authority is not Apple, right? And then it's designed to run at load, but then that architecture is i386. So that will get us to a state where pretty much it'll cover a lot of the launch agents and launch daemons that we're worried about that starts with com.apple. Another thing that you could do is also look for launch agents and launch daemons in general and use a technique called stacking, where you just collect all of the launch agents and daemons on a system and actually compare to see how many of those exist in the entire fleet, right? So if there's some of the common ones that are related to maybe like Spotify or Dropbox, right? Those have a higher spread across all the users in their environment. So in an enterprise of like 500, you might see that maybe like 30 or 40 times, right? But launch agents that are like one-offs, so maybe only one of those exists in the environment that makes it unique, then that's something you might want to key off of. So the next tactic that I'll go into is actually privileged escalation. And so once an attacker gains access to a system, more times than not, they have low-level privileges. But in order to carry out their objective, they'll actually need a higher level of privilege on the system, especially on Mac. So they'll need to modify some advanced settings, and in order to do that, it requires elevated privileges, right? So the bad thing about this is that most users on their Mac are typically admin or running as admin, right? So if you actually compromise the user in some way or gain access to their password, well then essentially you can just become an admin, right? And so one thing that doesn't help this is like vulnerabilities that exist that probably shouldn't exist because of just quality control issues. But root comes to mind, and that happened in 2007, where you were able to just enter root as the username and then press enter a couple times, and now you become an admin. So things like that definitely doesn't help the cause of privilege escalation. And so when we're on Mac OS systems, most of the time, user experiences too, you'll get a pop-up, and that pop-up will say something, right? And we'll get a bunch of these pop-ups throughout the day, and most of us either like cancel or we're entering something trusting that whatever privilege we just gave that application won't do some harm to our system, right? And so this is something to be aware of because attackers are actually doing the same thing where they'll provide a prompt to the user and maybe sometimes that'll be in a loop until the user enters in some information, right? Either credentials or something that will help them to get escalated, right? And so this is just one way that you can do that. So it's very trivial to create like an Apple script that will create a prompt and it'll collect the details once you press OK and store that somewhere, right? And we'll see that in a demo a little bit later. So with that now, we can create a hypothesis of the following. An attacker has compromised at least one system and has escalated privileges through the use of sudo, right? And so what can we do from a detection standpoint is actually baseline the use of sudo in our environment, right? So like Jaron mentioned earlier this morning, it was like, yeah, sudo exists. Your end users probably shouldn't be using sudo too often. Maybe your sysadmins or folks that are actually doing a lot of the admin work on your Macs and your fleet, but you can't expect the average person in your company to actually be using sudo too often, right? And then also monitoring for the use of security off trampoline, right? And so security off trampoline actually is related to the API call of authorization execute with privileges from the security framework. And so it'll prompt for elevated creds and then execute the code as a privileged user. And so process monitoring is actually a good data source to use for this sort of thing. So I'll go into the next tactic of defense evasion. So in order to discuss hunting for defense evasion in your environment, we also have to discuss what defensive mechanisms are in place on macOS systems currently. And so the first is file quarantine. So file quarantine is a security feature built into macOS designed to prevent infections. And so it'll prompt you to ensure that you really want to open a file that was downloaded from the web. It's meant to slow the user down, but it doesn't really prevent that malware or that code from running. It's just telling the user like, hey, you're potentially about to do something really stupid. Here's a second chance to kind of rectify that before we move further, right? And so how does file quarantine know that, like a specific file originated from the internet? Well, then once that file is downloaded, it has the extended attribute added and is similar to the mark of the web on Windows. And so complementary to file quarantine is Gatekeeper. So Gatekeeper was actually introduced in 10.7 to actually prevent untrusted code from running, right? So similar to file quarantine, but it'll check to see if the code is actually signed, and if not, then it'll prompt the user. So if signed, it'll also check to see if the code is signed by a trusted developer, and if not, it'll prompt the user. And it still leaves it up to the user to decide whether or not they want to actually run that code or not. It doesn't actually prevent anything from happening. It's just another mechanism to kind of slow things down, right? And so next we have XProtect. So XProtect is basically like the AV subsystem for macOS. And so it's updated from time to time, although like as of recently, it hasn't been touched as much. But it's located in System Library, Core Services, XProtect, Bundle, Contents, and Resources. So if you actually do a strings on that, or if you dump that out, you can actually see some of the Yara rules that are used to detect malicious things on macOS systems. And we'll get into why that's not such a great thing. But there's also the MRT, which kind of also the malware removal tool that actually like abstract some of those things away, and you can't really see the contents of what Apple is trying to detect. But as far as XProtect goes, we'll see that this can be easily evaded. And so the next thing we have is system integrity. Once malware gets onto the system, well, Apple doesn't want things to be awry or go awry, so it's kind of like the rootless mindset. So even though someone has God-level access to your system, there's only so much they can do due to entitlements given to files and directories. And so although this is a good thing for users and it protects a lot of things, especially from the system perspective, this has made it a pain in the rear end for a lot of the researchers out there. I mean, raise your hand if you have a VM that has SIP disabled. My point exactly. And so we have the Gatekeeper bypass. So Gatekeeper has been bypassed a lot, especially in modern day malware where the binary that's used, the malicious binary, is actually like signed using some developer ID, as I mentioned before. But then also curl and wget or Python are used to download files within an application or just download files in general that once that's downloaded, because terminal or the shell is not quarantine aware, it doesn't get hit with that quarantine extended attribute. And so Gatekeeper or file quarantine doesn't know to wake up the system to say, okay, like something bad might be happening, right? And so the most recent example of this at the top is actually some malware masquerading as a cryptocurrency ticker. And so that was something reported by Thomas Reed and the Malware Bytes guys. And so thanks for that. And in this case, they actually use curl to download a file, and then they use Python to execute that. And so that's one way to bypass Gatekeeper. Another way is actually to basically remove the extended attribute associated with a file that was downloaded from the internet. And so that's another way that malware is attempting to bypass Gatekeeper. One thing that I did mention is too that Expert can also be evaded. So because us as users can see the Yara SIGs for Expert, attackers can see them as well. And so some modifications to their code could be made such that it evades those Yara signatures, right? And so one hypothesis that we could come up with is an attacker has compromised at least one system and is attempting to evade defenses, especially SIP and or Gatekeeper. So with that, we can go to our trusty friend OS Query again and come up with some new queries. So we could select from the SIP config table, right? And then also give it the config flag of SIP, and then enabled equals 0. So that means that SIP is actually disabled on systems. So in a corporate environment, there shouldn't be many systems with SIP disabled, right? Because that requires you to actually go onto the box physically, actually boot using Command R, and then actually using things like CSRUtil disable. And so that's very unlikely for a user to actually know or actually do, right? And then also you have Gatekeeper where assessments enabled is equal to 0. So that means Gatekeeper is not enabled on the system, right? And so that could be used using the spctl command where you do -- master disable, and users probably shouldn't be doing that either. You need some escalated privileges to do that sort of thing. So these two things, if they exist on a corporate network, probably a sign that something has gone awry, or at least a chance to take a second look. And so the real-time piece, you can actually baseline the use of curl in your environment, right? So if you baseline the use of curl in your environment, you'll see that maybe folks are curling to pull down things related to maybe development, maybe things related to doing system administration, definitely not things that Jaron mentioned earlier where you're pulling down stuff from IP addresses and not actual like domain names, right? So that might be suspicious. And then also monitoring for the use of spctl to actually disable Gatekeeper, and then the use of xadder, right? Because most end users probably don't know what that is, probably never opened terminal in their life, and if you see a lot of execution of that, especially on one specific system, that's a heads up, right, to kick off the IR process. And so we'll get into the fun part of the presentation where here's the email here that some folks, it's very possible that can happen where the email is sent to all of your end users. Imagine that this has happened. Sent to all of your end users saying, hey, tomorrow all macOS systems will be updated to Mojave. You need to download this Apple script and actually run this command in order for your system to be fully able to continue running on the corporate network, right? So failure to do so might affect your ability to connect to the corporate network. So your end users get this, they start freaking out. They see things in red, they see a script, they're like, hey, like I need to do this, right? And the instructions here are very specific. They say, hey, open up the terminal app and actually enter in this command. So users could do that. And so I'll go into the monitoring, an example of some monitoring that you can do to actually set up in your own environment. So we have OS Query on a box. We also have xnewmon on a system. And then that data is being collected and it's outputted via JSON. And so from that, you can use FileBeat to actually send that to an ELK instance. So in this particular instance, I use Helk, which is a tool that is created by my colleague at SpectreOps, Roberto Rodriguez, which is basically a hunting elastic stack, right? And so from the attacker's perspective, they actually use Empire, which is a tool also created from the guys at SpectreOps that does Windows and Mac kind of remote access type things, right? So this is a demo that's coming up here shortly. So as a threat hunter, we could say, okay, an attacker has compromised at least one system in the environment and is executing malicious code via AppleScript, right? So this is the tactic of execution and then the technique of AppleScript. And so I'll get into the demo. All right. All right, we see that the user executed that command, and now we'll see the agent actually on the Empire side get kicked off, right? And so now, with that agent, they have full access to the system, and they're actually going to execute a module that will open an application and provide a prompt to the user, right? And so in this case, we're going to use the App Store because most folks, well, when it comes to the App Store, they're like, yeah, I need to download this app or make a change to some of the apps that I have on my system, right? So once this happens, we'll see that this is a totally realistic scenario that can exist. And so we see the agent here, we set it up, pointing to the App Store, and it's going to execute. So now we'll flip back to the user side and see exactly what happens. So once this gets kicked off, requires a password to continue. That looks pretty legitimate. It's using the actual App Store icon. And so they enter in their credentials, and then they press OK. It's like, OK, well, that's bad, but they don't know it's bad. And so we can see that it returns some results. So on the Empire side, we could go in and we could go to the directory that's associated with the agent that we just used to execute that command. And so we'll see here pretty shortly that that password was used, and it's not a really good one. So now we're just catting out the agent log, and we see that the text that was returned is Apple123. Right? Okay, cool. So what can we use? What can we use this for? Well, now we can use an existing module that asks for elevated privileges, assuming that the user is running as an administrator on their system. And so with the credentials, we could put those in and actually run another module that will spawn sudo and then actually kick back another agent to be used, right? And so this agent will run in elevated context. And so that's executed because now they have the password. And so we can see that that agent came back. And now we're good to go. So now we're a privileged user on this system. And now that we're a privileged user, we could go ahead and do things like install launch daemons instead of launch agents, right? And so the way we'll do that, we'll try to blend in using some of the same techniques that Jaron talked about earlier this morning. It was like throwing in some com.apple in there, putting it in a hidden directory, and then calling it com.apple.network update. So yeah, I mean, most users won't be familiar with that. They won't even know that it's happening in the background, right? So on the user side, it's completely quiet. And so we'll see that that'll get kicked off here pretty shortly. And you see the dot in front of the network update, that's the location that it's going to be. So it's going to be set into the user's context, and it's going to be a hidden file. So good luck to the IR team that has to go ahead and find that. So now we're kicking over to the hunt side. And so we're in Kibana here. And all of the data that we've been collecting is being sent off. So we're looking for OSA script associated with AppleScript executions. And so we see that 62 instances exist. And so with that, we want to dive a little bit deeper, right? So we want to see anytime that the binary OSA script has actually been executed on the system, not just like OSA script, right? Because there's some command line parameters that can have that in there. So we see 4 instances, which is pretty rare. We started out with 29,000 events that came in. And so we see network update, the AppleScript that was actually executed to kick off the initial agent. And so from that, we can see that, okay, like there was another AppleScript that told App Store to open up and actually to enter in a password to continue. So now as an incident responder, as a threat hunter, because your hypothesis came true, well, you're a little suspicious. You go into the ancestors, which are the parents, and you see that Python exists, and that's usually a bad sign. So OSA script kicking off Python, that's not normal in an environment. So now we want to look at anytime we see Python being used, right? And so We have all the executions of Python, and then we see in the arguments field, we see some base64 encoding, right? So with that, we can actually decode that, similar to PowerShell and encoded commands. So it's pretty easy to do that. Opening up CyberChef right here, which is a great resource to use. And so with that, throwing in the base64, and we get some data back. So this looks like a request going out to an IP address. And so that doesn't look too promising. So now as a threat hunter, as an incident responder, things are definitely like, the light bulbs are going off, like red alarm, red alert, like let's get the system off the network, right? But now that we have this data source, we actually want to pivot off of that. But initially, we could have caught this detection as well using some of the queries that I introduced, where we're looking for com.apple installed as a launch daemon that is unsigned, right? And so here, because we already had that set up, we can see that the launch daemon, when it was created, got logged. So that's another way too, from an IR perspective. Even though you had hunts that you're currently on, your previous hunts should have turned into detections for you to actually build upon. So we see that that query that we ran in OS query, running at an interval, came to fruition, and it gave us some fruitful results. And so now we'll go into doing visualizing some of the things that are going on as far as command line arguments and sudo, because we see that they were able to install the launch daemon, but we don't know exactly how they were able to do that, because that it involves elevated privileges, right? So we know from the attacker's perspective how they went about doing that, but we don't know that from incident response perspective. So this is after the fact now. The hunt is over. We're actually performing incident response. So now we're looking for all arguments that were used in the logs that we have so far. And so we see that sudo was used. Okay, well, that's interesting to us, right? So let's exclude that out. And then also we want to see some of the command line parameters that were used when sudo was called. So we'll get to that here pretty shortly. So this is a great example of like how you can set up detections and also continue to hunt, building on existing techniques and tactics out there using the MITRE ATT&CK framework. So we see that we have bin sh that was used along with sudo, right? They actually called sudo, so that's a little weird because most of the time it comes from bin bash. And so we see that Python and sudo were used twice in the same command line argument, and so that only happened twice out of the 29,000 events that we had started with. So that's of interest to us. And so if we enter that in to Kibana and do a search for it, we'll see that, hey, like this echo, Apple123, that looks like a password that a user could enter in. Okay, now we know on this system that, hey, like things are awry. They at least got elevated privileges on the system, and we want to do some extensive analysis to see all of the things that could have happened. So that's the end of the demo. All right, let me switch back to the presentation here. All right. Give me a second here. All right. All right, so that's the end of my presentation. I also want to give some credits to definitely Jonathan Levin for his book that he created. So volume 3 was very useful as far as IR and detection. If you're a detection, incident response, threat hunter on the macOS side, I highly recommend that book. Also, the stuff out there by Objective-C. Anytime that there's some malware that's been put out there or a user has come across, that's my go-to resource to actually pull apart some of the indicators from that, and also better than that, the tactic and the techniques that were used to actually build some really robust detections off of. And also some of the stuff that's put out there by Malwarebytes, especially the new cryptocurrency ticker that was put out there in the wild. So those are some of the resources that you can use, especially for IR and threat hunting on macOS. This time, I'll take any questions. You can find me at Twitter at @rrcyrus. Thank you. No questions? No. Yeah, so the command line arguments, that data source actually came from xnewmon. So xnewmon was running on the system, and xnewmon gives you the process command line arguments, the process itself, and then also the ancestry back all the way down to the launchd. So the question was, what was the file source that was used or shown in the demo? Any more questions? Patrick? Yeah, so I haven't seen it specifically for xnewmon, but there's some tools out there that test, like actually show signs of trying to detect things like little snitch being on the system existing on already. And so if it sees that, then the malware might execute a different way. But in its check for trying to determine whether little snitch exists on the system, that's also an opportunity as a defender to log that and look for that technique being used. So checking for existing tools on the system.
So you don't normally see a kill or like a process list?
Yeah, so that's another thing that you could key off of that you could probably do a detection for is that enumeration of a system. So the fact that someone used like something like PS or like top or something like that, if you have context around the host that came from, if that's someone in finance or someone that's in a sector that you wouldn't expect them to use that command, you could start to build detections off of that as well. Any additional questions? So the question was, is it hard to kind of delineate or work with MDM products that exist on Mac OS systems while running some of the monitoring tools I discussed? It's not hard. So as a defender or a threat hunter, the first thing, well, the main thing that you want to do before you actually start to hunt, right, or build a hunt team, is actually start to baseline some of the activity or some of the tools or resources that are used on your system. So you would actually take like a gold image or a baseline image and then understand what that activity looks like, right? And then now you can exclude that activity from whatever exists out there on user system. So you would know that you would have an MDM in place and what that MDM does from a system perspective, and then you would exclude that out. So that's one of the blind spots too, unfortunately, is that an attacker, maybe they get access to the MDM client somewhere on the environment, and now they're executing things on behalf of the MDM client where you just excluded that. But you would state that blind spot in in documentation. Any more questions? Mahalo.
Awesome, Richie. That was an incredible talk.